What's the value? What's the hope? What's the power of conversation here? If you could sit down with Vladimir Putin and have a conversation versus bullets, human exchange words, is there hope for those? And if so, what would you talk about? What would you ask him?
Well, Henry Kissinger, you alluded to his op-ed. He's had many private meetings with President Putin over a long time. And President Biden, the previous presidents, secretaries of state, officials below Secretary of State, the head of the CIA evidently met with President Putin in the fall when he was massing the troops on the border before he invaded. And we sent the head of the CIA, and Putin received him. Somebody he evidently respects or was at least willing to meet, unlike other members of the administration. So a lot of people are talking to him in some form or another for the 22 years he's been in power. And I'm not sure it's had what I would call their desired effect.
Well, the nature of the conversation is interesting too, and also the timing, which is post February 22nd, is a different time. And also another aspect, which Oliver Stone mentioned, interestingly, that there's something about COVID and the pandemic that creates isolation, the distancing. It's such a silly little nuanced thing, but maybe it's actually has a profound impact on the human being, the human mind of Vladimir Putin, that there is something about an in-person meeting and not across a table that's far too large.
Yes.
But sort of the intimacy of one human-to-human in-person conversation, that there's something distinctly powerful about that reminder there, that, as Putin says in the narrative, in the propaganda, that we're all one people. There is truth to that. That this entirety of humanity is one
right.
people. And you're kind of reminded by that when you're sitting together.
People who have sat across the table from him, whether at 30 yards or at 3, have remarked upon this feeling of isolation that has affected him, the pandemic. I think there must be something to that if several people who've been in the room with him are remarking on it. Everybody that I know and I've been able to talk to who's had a meeting with him in the past 10 years, including Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, has said that Putin spends a lot of time enumerating his grievances. He goes through a monologue of his grievances. And then the West did this, and then the West lied to us about that, and then the West cheated us on this. And so it's not the conversation that you're encouraging of common humanity. It's that roiling resentment volcano that's just exploding and exploding.
The resentment.
And by the time he gets through the monologue of the grievances, the time of the meeting is expired or overtime.
That's a brilliant statement, but that's where the skill of conversation comes in. Like when you're facing a bull with a red cloth, you have to learn how to avoid the long list of grievances and get to the humanity. That's a really important skill.
It's a skill. For sure, it's a skill, and it's the highest level skill of a diplomat, to be able to reach some type of common understanding when interests and worldviews clash so much. But here's your challenge, Lex. Your challenge is Russia wants to impose a closed sphere of influence on its neighbors. It wants to dictate what its neighbors can and can't do. It wants to exert influence not by the power of its example, not by the freedom of its people, not by the dynamism of its diversified economy, but it wants to exert influence just because it deserves that, just because it's a great power, just because, and on and on and on. It's a civilization unto itself. And it wants that, and we can't give that. The reason that Russia was not integrated into the West was not for lack of trying. It was because Russia ultimately spurned the integration because it was about what terms the integration would come on. Would you come into the West and observe Western rules and be another country, meaning just another country? There's Poland and there's Austria and there's little tiny Monaco and there's Russia. And you're just one of those countries. And Russia's answer to that was, no, we're not just one of those countries. We need special rules. We need special conditions. We'll integrate, but only as a special country, meaning like at the UN, where all countries are sovereign, all countries are members, but Russia has a veto on what countries can and can't do. Those were the terms on which they were willing to integrate. And those were the terms that no leader of a Western country or the United States or the G7 or fill in the blank can grant to Russia. It's very well known that Vladimir Putin was one of the first, maybe the first person, first leader, foreign leader, to call President Bush after the 9/11 tragedy. They didn't connect right away. President Bush was not in Washington, but eventually they did speak. He condemned the terrorist attack. He offered Russian support, which he delivered on. The use of some Russian logistics for our Afghanistan operations. And a lot of people point to that and they say, there it is. Russia wanted to cooperate and did cooperate, and we spurned them, or we failed to appreciate Russia's cooperation. And so therefore, Russia was cheated, or Russia was lied to, or Russia's grievances are legitimate. But here's the problem with that argument, Lex. In exchange for that support, Vladimir Putin asked in return from President Bush for a free hand in the former Soviet space, that closed hierarchical sphere of influence, where Russia would exert influence coercively over countries that were sovereign. And no American president could grant that, and President Bush was right. He said no. And so the attempted cooperation blew up.